The first 6-week stage of the ceasefire in the Middle East has only got a week to run, and the US Special Envoy is on his way to the region to negotiate further progress. Meanwhile, the UN continues with its game of false equivalence. Here's the latest from Fox News.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in an address before the 58th Human Rights Council in Geneva, warned he is gravely concerned over the rising violence in the occupied West Bank and human rights violations in Gaza.
Violations of human rights have skyrocketed since the horrific Hamas attacks of October 7 and the intolerable levels of death and destruction in Gaza.
This as Hamas threatens to derail ceasefire deal talks with Israel, saying further steps are conditional on Palestinian prisoners being freed as agreed.
Yeah, so where to next? Let's get some insights from former Israeli ambassador to the US, Michael Oren, who joins us from Sydney CBD. Thanks for joining us, Michael. There's so much I'd like to pick your brains about, but why don't I start in chronological order and talk about the security failure of Israel right at the start. I don't think there's been enough focus on this. We're aware on this program of the absolute horrors of the terrorist atrocities conducted by Hamas back on October the 7th, 2023. But with border posts and military outposts and surveillance and security in that part of Israel, how could it possibly been allowed to succeed to such an horrific level?
Good to be with you, Chris. And that's opening with a really hard question. It's a question that all Israelis ask themselves. How could we have been shocked, taken off guard in that way? Where was the army? Why did the army take so many hours to respond? And the answers are not just so simple. I was in government in the period before the war, and I know that it was almost across the board agreement within the Israeli government, between the political and the military echelon, that Hamas could be bought off. If Hamas got money from Qatar, if you let in 20,000 Palestinian workers into Israel every day, then Hamas would have something to lose. We would incentivize Hamas basically not to be a jihadist terrorist organization. And it proved to be false. Also, the army had been preparing for a completely different type of war. The army had become leaner, heavily dependent on technology, and rather dismissive of Palestinians' capabilities. Most of the focus was on Hezbollah in the north, which was, in fact, a much greater threat with 170,000 rockets and probably 100,000 terrorists under arms. Hamas didn't seem to be that competent. So people just all the time underestimated Hamas's viciousness, the fact that it didn't care about getting money, it didn't care about the safety and well-being of these Palestinian workers, was willing basically to just devastate the Gaza Strip in order to kill, rape, burn, behead, and capture Jews. That is the bottom line, Chris. And we've had to learn a very, very painful lesson. But Israel snapped back very, very quickly. The army enlisted 360,000 reservists. That would be the equivalent here of about 1 million Australians, roughly about the same number of Australians who fought all in World War II. They were enlisted within a week, and they went out to fight. And by all military criteria, it was one of the great military victories of all time.
Yeah, now let's talk about what's ensued from there, because you mentioned there Hamas as an Islamist jihadist outfit. And to me, this is a fundamental point that tends to lead to the contradictions and ignorance and hate speech we get around the world, because the anti-Israel protesters and the pro-Palestinian protesters, if you like, continually try to portray Hamas as some sort of legitimate liberation force for the Palestinian people, when it's not, is it? It's an Islamist extremist jihadist outfit, has been since the get-go, and tends to use the plight of the Palestinian people to achieve that goal, to follow that lead. Explain the difference to us and what it means.
Well, the word Palestine doesn't even appear in the name Hamas. Hamas is an Arabic acronym for the Islamic Liberation Movement. It's to transform Palestine, as they see it, into an Islamic state, and then that Islamic state will expand across the Middle East, and then from the Middle East it will encompass the entire globe and recreate a medieval Islamic kingdom under a caliphate. And in that way, Hamas is no different than ISIS, no different than Al-Qaeda, no different than the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is actually an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's it's not so much an ideology, Chris, as is a theology. And so they are determined to destroy Israel, to kill its inhabitants. They are not in favor of a two-state solution. They reject the two-state solution. I've been involved in Israeli public affairs now for over 30 years. I started as an advisor to Yitzhak Rabin. I've been involved in the peace process. Every time we made any type of progress toward peace, Hamas came out and not only killed Israelis, it killed Palestinians. Any Palestinians in favor of peace was thrown off a rooftop by Hamas in Gaza and had his body dragged through the streets of Gaza with a motorcycle. That is Hamas. And these people are out protesting for Hamas and think it's a peace organization, think it's a Palestinian nationalist organization, are all wrong. And if they had had these protests in Gaza, the same people would today be dead.
So look at the situation we have today. A ceasefire that's tenuous, that is holding for a while. Most of the hostages, dead or alive, have been returned to Israel, but there are still more than 50 outstanding, again, dead and alive, a horrible, macabre trading that's going on. But Hamas are clearly still in control, openly parading their soldiers now, heavily armed and faces masks in Gaza. What happens next? Because clearly Hamas needs to be removed from Gaza. How can this peace be made permanent, and how can you also control Iran's influence over all of this?
All excellent questions. Thank you, Chris. In fact, the matter is there are a number of day-after scenarios. There's an Egyptian-Saudi proposal. You've all heard about the Trump proposal about transforming Gaza into a Mediterranean Riviera. They all sound very good on paper. The fact of the matter is nothing can happen in Gaza for the reconstruction of Gaza, the transformation of Gaza into a peaceful area, peaceful neighbor for the state of Israel, as long as Hamas is there and as long as Hamas has the guns. Israel killed about 20,000 terrorists during this war. 10,000 are still there. You see them in these pictures. They still have the guns, and they still have our hostages. About 30 hostages we believe are left alive. We have to get them back. I'm willing to pay a very steep price to get them back. But at the end of the day, nothing will happen with Gaza as long as Hamas is there and not demilitarized. And frankly, there's only one way to demilitarize Hamas, and that's through the Israeli army. But the ultimate criteria for transforming Gaza into a peaceful area is by addressing the Iranian threat, because Iran is responsible for 99% of all the violence throughout the entire Middle East. They're the backer of Hezbollah, of the Houthis in Yemen, the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, and of course Hamas in Gaza. And so Israel, with the United States, I don't know whether it's physically with the United States or diplomatically with the United States, will have to address the Iranian threat. And once you address the Iranian threat, then Hamas, Hezbollah, all these terrorist organizations will be cut off from their main supplier, and they will wither on the vine.
Yes, indeed. That's the big picture game for the US, Israel, and countries like Australia supporting it, hopefully. Thanks for joining us, Michael. Fantastic to get your analysis.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me.